Hello friends, I am back in Visual Studio Code, the ID I will use throughout this course. And this is again a total empty folder. Now create a new file with command or by pressing this icon here, and this file can have any name you want. But often you name it server.js or app.js. It is the root file that make up your Node.js application. So the Node.js code you will execute on a computer, in the cloud, on a server, in the and so I will name it app.js here. Now in this file I want to create a server through Node.js, and thus for in the first module we only saw how we can work with the file system. So how can we now spin up such a server? We again need to import some functionality because the way JavaScript works both for the browser and Node.js. There is handful of functions and objects we can use globally without importing anything into the file. But generally, most functionality aren't available by default to not pollute our global namespace with all these reserved keyword and name basically, and also to make it very obvious in each file on each functionality this file depends, and thus for this file does not depend on anything. Now there are a couple of core module Node.js shipping with, and as you will learn through this course, you can also install third-party modules which do not ship with Node, but let's stick to the core module for now. Here are a handful of them. Now, not all core modules, just some, and as you can see, there is FS, which is already there is also there is also path which help us with constructing path. So path to the file on file system that work on operating system because Windows and Mac and Linux use different path format. There is a operating system package will help us with operating system relevant information and so on. And there are the two topmost package, HTTP and HTTPS. And you might be able to guess these two sound these two sound very helpful when it's come to create a server and working with HTTPS, HTTP request responses. And indeed, HTTP help us with launching a server or also with other tasks like sending request, because a node app could also send a request to another server. You can have multiple servers communicate with each other. For example, you could send a request for Google Maps API. Just an example, let's keep it smile here and let's focus on the launch server aspect. HTTPS would be helpful when we want to launch a SSL encode server. So we will all the data which is transferred is encrypted. And I mentioned earlier, this is something I will come back to towards the end of the course. HTTP module, and to use it we need to import it. So basically need to make sure that we can use feature from HTTP module which Node.js ship with, but which still is not available globally by default. We need to make sure that we can use this feature in this file. And for this, we import that functionality. We do this by creating a new constant. To, and you could create a where or use let to, but since we will use some value here which we use never change, we can also just use a const to make this really clear that we will never touch this again. We will use it, but we will never overwrite it. And you can give this any name you want by typically to keep the name of module you are importing. So I will name this HTTP. But again, you could rename this to whatever you want. Then you have an equal sign. You have an equal sign, and now we need to assign a value. And now here is there is a special keyword function Node.js that's exposed globally, so you can use it by default in any file you run via Node.js, and that is the require keyword. That is the require keyword. Now, this is simply the way you import file in Node.js. Require either task takes a path to another file. You can also import your own JavaScript file, but we will never not do this for now. We will not do this for now. Heavily through the course, or if you don't have path one of our file, you can also import the core module like HTTP. By the way, a path to one of your files always had a start with dot slash. If isn't an absolute path, dot slash would be a relative path. Lead to the same folder and would now look for a HTTP file. By the way, it automatically add .js at the end. You don't need to add that your own, but you can. But this would now look for a local file name HTTP. If you omit dot slash at the beginning, it will never look for a local file. It will never look for a local file. So even if you had a file name http.js, it would not import this file. Let's get read it, but instead of it, we will always look for a global module named HTTP, and indeed such a module exists because Node.js ship it. So we got this imported, and now we can start using functionality from the global module. And HTTP dot, this is how you access the function or so called method and properties on object. In JavaScript, as you can see, this HTTP object which we import from the HTTP module has a bunch of field and method you can execute. Most importantly, it has a create server method. Now, as the name suggested, this is a crucial method when it comes to, well, creating a server, and create server actually it would hover over it. We can see it actually takes a so-called listener as an argument, or request listener simply is a function that will execute for every incoming request. So let us define such a function. For this, I will create a new function with the help with the function keywords. We can name it however you want. RQ listener or whatever you want. The name is the name is totally up to you, and this function has received two arguments. You can see that here, if you hover over that, the request listener receive request which is type which is of type incoming message and response object. So in short, Node.js automatically give us some object that represent the incoming request and allow us to read data from that request, and it gives us an object response which we can use to return a response to whoever sent that request. So now we have to accept these two request argument here, and you can again name the argument however you want. You will just have to keep in mind that first one will contain data about the request, and second one will help the sender response. So I will name it REQ and RES. And these are typical shortcuts you often see. Now, this is a function RQ and now we can pass this function reference so we doesn't execute it, doesn't set these curly braces. Just pass the name of that function because this will simply tell create server, hey, please look for this function with this name and execute it for every incoming request. So this is now what we will set up. This function will now run for every request that reach our server, which we will started by calling create server, or almost one piece is missing. I will come back to that. Now, this is one way of doing it. Now, you don't have to explicitly create such a function through. You can also use a so-called anonymous function. So, here you can also type function req res like this. This is now a function without a name. That is way it's called anonymous and it still achieves the same. We first pass that function to create server and therefore node will execute this function whenever a request reach our server. This is event driven architecture Node.js uses heavily. You work a lot such setups or such code snip wherever you will tell node if X happen, do Y. So in this case, if request come, please execute this function. Now you can use a next gen JavaScript syntax and use a arrow function wherever you omit the function. Keyword and have the two argument followed by an equal sign and a greater sign. Hence, an arrow and that and then the function body. This is basically an equivalent to the function keyword approach. Okay, so this is our create server callback function and it's called by Node.js whenever a request reach our server. For now, let's simply console log the request object and see what inside. Now, if we will execute the file, we can do this in the built-in terminal which is already which is already navigate into this project folder. Make sure you go in that project folder. If you are using the terminal outside of that IDE, so once you are in a terminal, navigate it in that folder, you can run node and then app.js, and this will execute the app.js file, and let's see what does. Hmm, nothing right. We don't see console log, and that makes sense because we didn't send a request to the server, but we don't even know wherever the server is. How do we reach that server? Which address does it have? Well, one important thing is missing. A create server method actually returns a server. So we have to store that in a new variable or constant, and I will use the constant because I will never overwrite it. I only create a server once. So now the created server is stored, and now we can use that server and do something with it. As you can see, we get a bunch of methods we can call. One method is a listen. Listen now actually starts a process start a process where node will not immediately exit or script, but where node.js will instead keep it running to listen. That's why the method is named like this for incoming request. Now listen listen, as you can see, take a couple of argument optional argument. The first one is the port. The first one is the port on which you want to listen. Now, in production, you typically would not fill this out, and it would take the default of port 80. But here on local development, we want to use a different port, and you can also define a host name by now. Default. This be the name of the machine this is running on. So our local machine is the local host by default. So let's pass the port. 3000 is a port you often use, but you are relatively you are relatively free to use any port you want. The 1000 port are typically safe. And now with that, if we execute this, you will see one important thing. The cursor Here in the terminal, doesn't go back in the new line because this process here now is still running. I didn't finish this file execution didn't finish because we now get a ongoing loop process where this will keep a listen for request, and this is obviously what you want, right? You want to have a web server and keep on listen request. Now we can see that action is opening in the new browser. Simply enter localhost. And once you did that, nothing happened because we haven't configured it return a HTML page. But you will go back to the terminal. You see lot of output and this line, this is your request being logged in the console. Now let's analyze what happened here in detail and what's inside this request. Over the next lecture, but these few lines are already give you a fully functional or almost fully functional web server. And this is how you create a server in Node.js, and I know that this can be hard to wrap your head around because it was for me when I started out with Node.js years ago. It was difficult to understand that coming from a PHP background, you suddenly write your own server that sounded like something super complex. Well, actually, it's just these few lines, and from now on, we will just have to focus on doing something meaningful with the request and important sending back to response. So, time for detailed analysis.